The woman known to history as Isabella of France or Queen Isabella of England was born at some point in the mid-1290s in Paris in France, most likely in 1295 or possibly 1296. The exact date is unclear, a not uncommon occurrence when it comes to medieval births, for which records can often be fragmentary. Her father was King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair on account of his alleged good looks. He had succeeded to the French throne in 1284. Philip was also King of Navarre on account of his marriage to Isabella's mother, Queen Joan of Navarre, a small kingdom which lay primarily on the Spanish side of the Pyrenees in what is now the Basque country in the northeast of Spain. She and Philip had married in 1284. Isabella was their sixth child. Two daughters had been born before her, Margaret at some point in the late 1280s, and Blanche in 1290. Blanche died when she was 3 years old in 1294, before Isabella came into the world, and Margaret would also die in childhood in 1300, making Isabella her father's only daughter within a few years of her birth, and hence a valuable bargaining chip when it came to the politics of Western Europe. Isabella also had 4 brothers: Louis, born in 1289, Philippe, born around 1291, Charles, born in 1294, and Robert, born in 1296 or 1297, and thus Isabella's only younger sibling. Robert would die too in childhood, but Louis, Philippe, and Charles would each live to become kings of France and Navarre, one after another. The political circumstances of both France and England by the time of her birth in the late 13th century are critical to understanding the trajectory of Isabella's entire life. Unlike in early modern and modern times, France was not a united kingdom during either the High Middle Ages or the later medieval period. It was deeply divided, with powers such as the Dukes of Burgundy holding extensive lands in the east of the country, and others, such as the Counts of Flanders, dominating the region around much of Belgium and northeastern France. The papacy in Rome even controlled a small fiefdom in southern France centered on the city of Avignon. The kings of France nominally claimed control over the whole country, yet their power was prone to rising and falling over the decades, with various nobles and lords exercising great amounts of independence when there were weak rulers in Paris. In contrast, King Edward I of England had created one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe since his accession in 1272, imposing English control over Wales and also waging war on Scotland to try to unify all of Britain under his rule, while he also held extensive lands in Ireland. In France, Edward held much of the southwest of the country around Bordeaux and its hinterland as Duke of Aquitaine, though this was a far cry from his predecessors in the 12th century, who at one time had held nearly half of the territory of modern-day France, with vast regions in the north and west being under English control. What this French legacy meant was that the affairs of the kings of England and France were inextricably interconnected, and this would impact on Isabella's life when she was just a child. It would continue to do so down to the end of her life, and her son would attempt to impose himself as King of France from the late 1330s onwards. Unlike many of her predecessors as Queen of England in the 12th and 13th centuries, there are a large number of sources extant today for the study of Isabella's life. Many of these were chronicles written in the medieval tradition by figures like Thomas Walsingham, a late 14th century Benedictine monk who wrote an extensive history of the rulers of England from the early 14th century up to his own time. Another was Walter of Swinbrook, whose Chronicon Angliae, or English Chronicle, charted the reigns of Isabella's husband Edward II and her son Edward III, in the process providing many details on Isabella herself and her role in both. A French chronicler, Guillaume de Nangis, wrote extensively on events at the end of the 13th century in a way which pertains to Isabella's very earliest years and the circumstances that gave rise to her marriage with Edward II. Similarly, the Wigmore Chronicles, a set of annals of major events in English history between the middle of the 11th century and the start of the 14th, also casts light on the political circumstances in England when Isabella arrived there, while there was a growing amount of bureaucratic records being produced in 14th century England due to it being the most centralized state in Western Europe at the time. Yet these sources have their limitations. Medieval chroniclers did not write with the aim of maintaining an objective perspective as modern historians aspire to. Instead, they often wrote to persuade their readers of their own political views, and so many presented Isabella in a negative light for her actions in disobeying the normal bonds of matrimony at the time. As will become clear, though, her actions were often those of a woman who had learned from a young age to survive by her wits. In a somewhat unusual development which points to the evolution of European society on the cusp of the Renaissance, Isabella was afforded an elite education, something which was not customary for women in the 13th century for the most part, and which had only become common for royal princes in the 12th century. Many rulers as recently as the 11th century had been illiterate and left the business of government largely to church figures and scribes, considering warfare their true domain. Around the Louvre Palace and the Palais de la Cité in Paris, she was surrounded by some of the leading scholars of the age at the University of Paris, and at her father's court she had access to tutors from a young age and a wide library. She grew up, as a result, to be one of the most educated royal women of the High Middle Ages. From the moment she was born, her father was doubtlessly considering who she would be married to. Incredibly, Philip had betrothed one of his daughters, Blanche, to the Infante or Prince of Castile, the future King Ferdinand IV, when she was just an infant, the better to ally France with the powerful Spanish kingdom. When she died, he then betrothed his daughter Margaret to Ferdinand, but when Margaret too passed in 1300, he declined to arrange for his final daughter to potentially marry the Castilian prince. The reason was that Isabella, who was perhaps as young as 3 or 4 years of age at the time, had been promised to Prince Edward of England, the son and heir of King Edward I, in 1299. In 1294, Isabella's father had gone to war with England in an effort to seize the Duchy of Aquitaine from Edward I while he was otherwise distracted by a war in Scotland. This unhappy conflict dragged on for several years without any conclusive results on both sides, and by 1297 both parties had decided that continuing the conflict was not worth the cost in men and money. Peace negotiations were entered into and were finally concluded in 1299 when the 60-year-old Edward I, a widower for nearly a decade, married Philip's 17-year-old sister Marguerite, while Isabella was betrothed to Prince Edward, who at least was closer to her in age, having turned 15 in the spring of 1299. The match remained simply a betrothal at this early stage, Isabella being considered too young for a marriage to actually take place even by the standards of the medieval period. Instead, the wedding would not take place for nearly a full decade longer. It was finally solemnized at the Church of Our Lady in the town of Boulogne on the northern coast of France, overlooking the English Channel, on the 25th of January, 1308. By then, Edward was 23 years of age, while Isabella was nearing her teenage years, an age that was considered to be old enough for marriage in the 14th century. By then, Isabella was marrying a king rather than a prince. Edward I had died 6 months earlier, and her new husband had succeeded him as King Edward II. It would be a problematic union from the very beginning, as Edward was bisexual and tended to prefer the company of men, though he was not averse to women, and he sired an illegitimate son a few years before his marriage to Isabella. His preference for male company also extended to favouring certain male individuals at court and allowing them and their families and factions to rise to positions of great power and wealth, something which would fracture the political community in England during his 20-year reign, shaping Isabella's life as well, in many ways in the process. A prevailing myth concerning Isabella is her relationship with the Scottish rebel William Wallace. At the time that Isabella was first betrothed to Prince Edward, his father, King Edward I, had been involved in a long-running war with the Scottish, led by a number of prominent nobles and knights, including William Wallace. This was all part of England's constant attempts throughout the High Middle Ages and late medieval period to impose control over all of Britain, including Scotland. Edward had famously largely conquered Scotland in the mid-1290s, dragging the Stone of Scone, the inauguration stone used by Scottish kings, back to England in 1296 as a symbol of the destruction of Scottish independence. It was a temporary development, however, and the Scots were soon at war with England again. William Wallace was captured as part of this new rebellion in Glasgow in 1305 and was executed in August of that year at Smithfield in London. Isabella was around 10 years old at this time and was still living in France. The suggestion that she ever knew or had a relationship with Wallace is a complete invention, though England's relationship with Scotland and the conflicts between the two nations would feature prominently in the politics of her time as Queen of England. Almost as soon as Isabella arrived in England, despite her young age, she would have been aware of a growing concern at court and wider afield about the influence of one Piers Gaveston over her husband. Gaveston was the son of a Gascon knight from England's territories in western France, who King Edward I had assigned to his son and heir, Edward's household, in the early 1300s. The relationship soon became problematic as Gaveston's influence over the younger Edward grew and rumours flew about the court. Edward I exiled Piers from the court as a result in the mid-1300s, and then, after a brief rapprochement in 1306, ordered him to leave England entirely in 1307. Yet the old king's death just a few months later saw Gaveston being recalled, and the new king now promoted him to the title of Earl of Cornwall, while also granting him and friends and family members extensive lands and offices. All of this was creating immense unrest amongst the nobility of England, many of whom noted that the earldom of Cornwall had typically been reserved for a member of the royal family. This opposition included a faction led by the Earls of Warenne, Hereford, Pembroke and Lincoln, who, just weeks after Isabella arrived in England, urged Parliament to demand that Edward exile Gaveston yet again. The king relented, in large part because Isabella's father sent word from France that he was unhappy with news of this court favourite to whom Edward bestowed such favours, when his energies should have been on making his new wife feel at home in a foreign land. King Philip was no doubt especially dismayed to learn that when Edward and Isabella's joint coronation took place at Westminster Abbey near London, a month to the day after their marriage in northern France, Gaveston was central to the ceremony, being decked out elaborately and leading the king and queen through the main aisle of the abbey during the procession. Something clearly had to change, and Gaveston was exiled yet again, being sent off on this occasion to act as the king's lieutenant in the lordship of Ireland. Ireland was only a short boat ride away from Wales, and it was perhaps inevitable that Edward, who had been miserable when Gaveston left, conspired for Piers to return secretly in the summer of 1309. A fresh political storm followed in the months after this as it became known that Gaveston was back in England. For her part, Isabella was by then of an age to be able to fully appreciate some of the political nuances of what was happening, and also the difficult marital situation which her husband's relationship with the upstart was creating. This included the uncomfortable scenario in which Edward, Isabella and Piers ended up heading north to oversee a military campaign against the Scots, who were making incursions into northern England under their new leader, Robert Bruce, the aspirant to the throne of Scotland. Edward's decision to give Gaveston command over much of the campaign that followed was sufficient cause for the nobles to yet again call for his exile in 1311. A final departure and return to England was the limit of their patience. When he reappeared in England in 1312, a cohort of nobles led by the Earls of Lancaster, Warwick and Pembroke orchestrated to have him detained and killed that summer. Isabella must have breathed a sigh of relief, but there would soon be a new royal favourite and new problems, while the tensions between Edward and his nobles would continue virtually unabated for the next 15 years. Eventually, as she grew older and learned to look after her own interests, Isabella would move from being a bystander in these political intrigues to a major player herself. Isabella's relief at the death of Gaveston in the summer of 1312 was added to by the birth of her and Edward's first child just a few months later. Edward of Windsor was born on the 13th of November 1312 at Windsor Castle and was named after both his father and grandfather. Young Edward, like his mother, would have to grow up prematurely in his early teenage years as political events conspired around him. All of that was to come, though. In the interim, Isabella and Edward II had 3 further children, while suffering at least one miscarriage. Another boy, John, was born in 1316, solidifying the line of succession with 2 male heirs. 2 daughters then followed, Eleanor of Woodstock in the summer of 1318 and Joan in the summer of 1321, often referred to as Joan of the Tower, as her mother gave birth to her in the Tower of London, the city's great medieval and early modern fortress. Isabella was seemingly central to one of the more colourful episodes to occur at the French court in the early 14th century, the Tour de Nesle affair, named after a guard tower of the old city walls of Paris. Each of her brothers had married into the nobility of Burgundy of eastern France, which, as we have seen, was a powerful rival to the French crown for dominance over large parts of the country, and would remain so for another century and a half. Her brother, Louis, for instance, married Margaret of Burgundy, the second daughter of Robert II, Duke of Burgundy. Philippe married Joan, the daughter of Count Otto IV of Burgundy. Finally, Joan's sister Blanche of Burgundy married Isabella's other brother, Charles. The affair has taken on a quasi-legendary aspect over the centuries. Rumour at the time had it that, on a major state visit to France in the summer of 1313, shortly after the Gaveston affair had seemed to bring a period of temporary peace to England, Isabella had sewn some purses for each of her brothers and her sisters-in-law. Not too long afterwards, at a social gathering at court, she noticed that two knights, Sir Gautier of Aunay and Sir Philippe of Aunay, were carrying the purses which she had embroidered for two of her sisters-in-law, Blanche and Margaret. Fearing that they were engaged in affairs with the two knights, Isabella relayed her concerns to her father. King Philip responded by having some of his spies monitor the two knights and his two daughters-in-law. The results of the investigations led to the conclusion that Blanche and Margaret had been engaged in infidelities, meeting the two knights at the Tour de Nesle Tower along the city walls. In the ensuing fallout, it was also concluded that while Philip's wife, Joan, had not been unfaithful to her husband, she had known of the affair her sister Blanche was engaged in and was complicit in a sense as a result. In the period that followed, both Blanche and Margaret were arrested and placed in prison, while Sir Gautier and Sir Philippe were executed for their role in what was a serious social and political embarrassment for the French royal family. Blanche and Margaret were placed on trial and subjected to a public humiliation by having their heads shaved. They were then sent to the Château Gaillard. Margaret died within a year, perhaps on the orders of her husband, who had become king after Isabella's father's death in November 1314, while Blanche remained imprisoned until her marriage was finally annulled in 1322, and her husband was free to marry again. Joan was eventually forgiven by her husband for her alleged role in covering up her sister and sister-in-law's actions. Isabella came out of the entire affair looking poorly to the French populace, who eventually felt sympathy for Margaret and Blanche's plight. The royal visit to France in the summer of 1313 was important in other ways. It was an episode which saw Isabella emerge for the first time as a significant power broker between England and France, and her entry into the world of high politics as she became what we would now deem to be a young woman. The occasion was the triple knighting of her three brothers, who would then knight hundreds of other Frenchmen in a grand royal occasion which symbolized the arrival of a new generation of French nobles and leaders. Days of celebrations occurred in which Edward and Isabella were often central. There was a formal event as well, in which many individuals, Isabella included, took the cross, the symbol of the Crusaders that had been worn since 1095 when the First Crusade began, though by 1313 the Crusader states in the Holy Land had all been conquered by the Islamic powers there. We get an insight into the foibles of royalty here, as one chronicler noted with some amusement that Edward and Isabella overslept for the ceremony of the taking of the cross. More seriously, negotiations followed in the days ahead in which King Philip, Isabella's father, assured Edward that he would have support from France if he needed it against his fractious nobles back in England. Isabella had seemingly been central to the diplomacy involved. Back in England, Isabella was soon learning that the murder of Gaveston had not brought an end to the domestic turmoil of her husband's realm. In the months prior to Gaveston's fall, the faction which was opposed to him had come to be controlled by Thomas, 2nd Earl of Lancaster, a first cousin of Edward's, whose grandfather was King Henry III, and whose father, Edmund Crouchback, had been King Edward I's brother. Thomas also traced his ancestry on his mother's side back to the royal families of France and Navarre. This made Lancaster the most powerful noble in England, and he had been instrumental in Gaveston's downfall. After the favourite was murdered, there followed an uneasy reconciliation between him and the king, one in which it was made clear that Edward was a monarch whose power had been seriously undermined. The years that followed were consequently characterized by continuing political turmoil. compounded when the Scots won a major victory over the English at the Battle of Bannockburn in June 1314, gaining the upper hand in the Scottish War of Independence in the process. As Edward lay on the precipice of losing Scotland, which his father had largely completed the conquest of 20 years earlier, his standing in the eyes of his nobles plummeted even further. The years that followed were marked by a growing drift towards outright conflict yet again between Edward and his nobles. The instability was compounded by a major famine between 1315 and 1317, aroused by bad weather and the mass outbreak of a bovine disease which eviscerated cattle stocks across England. The Crown did nothing to assuage public opinion during this time by continuing its lavish spending, Isabella included, who had developed a habit of wasting large amounts of money on overt pomp and ceremony. When she had visited France without her husband in 1314, for instance, the expedition required 27 ships and 13 barges to transport all of her belongings and servants across the Channel. Such frivolous expense did not go unnoticed amongst her and Edward's subjects. Yet, as damaging as the famine of the mid-1310s, the loss to the Scots, and the Crown's profligate spending were, the issue which would spark another crisis and war was the king's continuing promotion of court favourites. For a time after Gaveston was murdered, the individual involved was Roger d'Amory, but he was soon displaced in the king's affections by Hugh Despencer the Younger, the son and heir of Hugh Despencer the Elder, Baron Despencer. As Despencer rose as a new version of Gaveston in the late 1310s, a Despencer faction emerged as well, with many individuals around him being given lands, titles, and offices by the king. The nobles were not impressed, and in May 1321, war broke out in England as a faction led by Lancaster, Humphrey de Bohun, 4th Earl of Hereford, and a former Lord Lieutenant of the English Lordship in Ireland, Roger Mortimer, emerged to challenge Edward and the Despensers. The Despencer War, as it is often termed, lasted for 10 months between May 1321 and March 1322. In its early stages, the alliance of anti-Despencer nobles had the better of it and converged on London. It was this military action which forced Isabella to take refuge in the Tower of London and so gave birth to her daughter Joan there. It was just weeks later that Isabella intervened, with Edward apparently going down on her knees before her husband and imploring him to expel Despencer from England in order to bring peace back to the country. Incredibly, Edward agreed to her request and commanded Hugh and his father to leave the country. However, Isabella was also central within weeks to the renewed outbreak of hostilities when, on a pilgrimage to Canterbury, she was refused entry to and hospitality at Leeds Castle in Kent, an abode of Bartholomew de Badlesmere, a lord who had sided with Lancaster and others against Edward just months earlier. The king took this rebuff of his wife as the excuse he needed to recommence the war, and within weeks the Despensers were back in England with fresh reinforcements. By the spring, it was all over, with Edward and the Despensers having won victory over Lancaster, Hereford, Mortimer, and their allies at the Battle of Borough Bridge on the 16th of March 1322. Whether Isabella was an oblivious pawn in Edward's machinations and he simply used the event at Leeds Castle as an excuse to resume hostilities, or whether her entire pilgrimage to Canterbury was a clever ploy which Isabella had been complicit in, remains a mystery to this day. Victory in the Despencer War saw Edward exact revenge for a decade of wrongs which he believed had been committed by his nobles. Hereford was killed in the fighting at Butter Bridge, seemingly dying in a particularly gruesome manner, his screams apparently dismaying his soldiers and contributing to the defeat. Lancaster was placed on trial, where a panel led by the Despensers refused to let him speak in his own defence and found him guilty. He was executed 6 days after Butter Bridge, while Mortimer was detained and sentenced to death. However, he would have his sentence commuted to life imprisonment in the Tower of London in what was a significant development for Isabella's future affairs. He escaped from the Tower in August 1323, and after a brief effort to raise a fresh revolt against the crown, fled to France. In the interim, the Despensers and their faction now had free rein to rule England as they wished. For his part, Edward began inflicting punishment on anyone who he perceived to have been responsible for Gaveston's murder back in 1312, and the undermining of his royal authority ever since. Dozens of lords and members of their families were placed in prison. Others were even less fortunate. Bartholomew de Badlesmere, the owner of Leeds Castle, where Isabella's being refused hospitality in the late autumn of 1321 had reignited the Despenser War, was dragged by a horse through the streets of Canterbury before being hanged and decapitated outside the town, his head placed on a pike overlooking anyone who entered or left the Kentish religious centre as a symbol of Edward's newfound power and tyranny. If Edward believed in the mid-1320s, in the aftermath of the Despenser War, that he was finally free from opposition and could rule as much as he pleased, he would soon find out that he was wrong. And with Lancaster, Hereford, and many of his other opponents dead, the opposition would now come from a different, unexpected source: his wife. There were multiple reasons for her growing alienation. In late 1322, she was placed in danger while in northern England when her husband failed to respond quickly enough to a Scottish incursion into the north of the country. More worryingly, in January 1322, Isabella's brother Charles had ascended to the throne of France as King Charles IV. Over the next year or so, relations between England and France deteriorated over a number of issues, of which Edward's position as Duke of Aquitaine in western France was central. As this occurred, the Despensers began targeting Isabella herself and her large number of French staff, many of whom had lived with her in England since her arrival in 1308. In all, 27 of her household staff were removed and arrested on the grounds of being French, as well as her chaplain and personal physician. The Queen was also stripped of most of her personal lands, and her household budget was drastically reduced. The final straw was when the Despensers removed her 3 younger children, John, Eleanor, and Joan, from her custody and entrusted their upbringing to Hugh Despenser's wife and sister. All of these attacks on her would combine to lead Isabella to begin plotting her own assault on the Despensers and her husband from the mid-1320s onwards. The opportunity she had been looking for came when she was sent as an envoy to France in March 1325. Isabella was dispatched across the Channel with a large retinue of staff who were loyal to Edward and the Despensers, her instructions being to negotiate peace terms in the war which had erupted between England and France, and then to return so that Edward could finally settle the war with the Scots without fear of French intervention. She was determined to act differently. Over a period of several months of negotiation in France, she moved the debate to concentrate on whether or not her husband, as Duke of Aquitaine, would come to France to pay homage to her brother, who, as King of France, was theoretically Edward's liege lord. Edward was unwilling to do this, but in response, Isabella proposed an alternative solution in the early autumn of 1325. If her 12-year-old son, Prince Edward, was sent to France, Charles would accept him paying homage as the basis for peace without his father, King Edward II, having to do so. Such a neat solution was quickly accepted, and Prince Edward, who was conveniently in southern England at the time, was conveyed across the Channel to his mother. King Edward and the Despensers had fallen for the trap. With Prince Edward, the eldest son and heir to the Kingdom of England, now in Isabella's custody and the safety of her brother's French dominions, she was in a position to launch her own campaign against her husband and the Despensers. Isabella's actions in the autumn of 1325 were compounded in the months that followed by her developing liaison with Roger Mortimer, one of the leaders of the opposition to the crown during the Despenser War, who had subsequently been imprisoned and then escaped from the Tower of London. There is no evidence to indicate, as some historians of the 19th century attempted to argue, that Isabella helped Mortimer escape from the Tower back in 1323 before he fled to France. On the other hand, there is no doubt that in France, in late 1325, she began meeting with Mortimer, who had become the de facto head of an anti-crown and anti-Despenser party of English exiles in Paris. The relationship became sexual towards the end of 1325. Isabella must have been aware how risky all of her behavior now was. After all, 2 of her sisters-in-law had been placed on trial and imprisoned over a decade earlier during the Tour de Nesle affair, owing to their infidelities. The affair she now began with Mortimer was to be one of the most colourful in the history of medieval Europe, one which burned brightly for half a decade and impacted hugely on England's politics, while also transgressing deeply held ideas of the time concerning matrimony and patriarchy. A more colourful description might suggest that they were somewhat like a medieval royal Bonnie and Clyde. By early 1326, with Prince Edward in their custody and a growing amount of financial and military support being provided by Isabella's brother, King Charles IV, Isabella and Mortimer were ready to make their move against her erstwhile husband and the Despensers. On the 22nd of September 1326, with a small flotilla of ships and men, she set sail for England. Ships mainly provided by Count Guillaume of Hainaut, whose daughter Philippa Isabella had promised her son Prince Edward would marry in return for his support. They landed on the coast of Suffolk in East Anglia 2 days later. In the days that followed, the unpopular and tyrannical regime of Edward and the Despensers collapsed, as leading nobles and lords abandoned the crown and sided with the small army of invaders from France led by Isabella and Mortimer. Calls for troops to muster in defence of the government were ignored, while towns and cities such as Cambridge opened their gates to the small army from France. By early October, as Isabella and Mortimer moved towards London, Edward fled from the capital towards the West Midlands and then into Wales. On the 16th of November, the invasion culminated in its great success when Edward and Despenser were captured in southern Wales. Edward's fate would wait for later, but 8 days later Despenser was found guilty in a perfunctory trial, following which he was hung from the city walls of Hereford before being disemboweled and castrated while still alive, the ordeal of being hanged, drawn, and quartered only coming to an end when the executioner beheaded him. Despenser was dead, and Isabella and Mortimer were in charge of England. But there was still the somewhat tricky matter of the king, who was still alive and also married to Isabella. Initially, he was placed into the custody of Henry of Lancaster at Monmouth Castle. In the weeks thereafter, Isabella's advisers devised an ingenious way of dispensing with him. Edward had briefly taken ship in the Irish Sea in the desperate days before he was captured. He had been forced to land in Wales, but the incident was now used to deploy an argument that in abandoning his kingdom, Edward had abdicated his crown. The logic followed that when he did so, Isabella and his eldest child, Prince Edward, succeeded him as King Edward III. Thus was the 14-year-old Edward installed as king in January 1327, though with Isabella and Mortimer now heading up a regency government on his behalf during his minority. They would be the real power behind the throne for years to come. The deposed king was moved to Berkeley Castle in the spring of 1327. He was, apparently, well treated there in his imprisonment for the next several months. That is, until the 21st of September, when he was almost certainly discreetly murdered on Mortimer and Isabella's orders. Isabella and Mortimer were received in England when they arrived from France in the autumn of 1326 as saviours from the quasi-tyranny of Edward II and the Despenser faction. However, many people soon realized that they had simply swapped one form of irresponsible kleptocracy and heavy-handed rule for another. In particular, the land grab which Isabella and Mortimer engaged in the course of 1327 and 1328 was incredible. Isabella had her dower lands, which had been stripped from her back in 1323, returned to her, but in addition, she seized huge estates which made her wealthier than any magnate had been in England for decades, with an annual rental from her lands across England and Wales that exceeded, by a considerable margin, those that Thomas of Lancaster, the greatest noble in the kingdom during much of Edward II's reign, had controlled. She also seized half a dozen prominent castles across England, notably Bristol Castle and Pontefract. She'd go on to drain the exchequer of any remaining funds, some admittedly to pay off her soldiers, but others to finance her own largesse in the years ahead. The behaviour was echoed by Mortimer, who quickly seized vast estates across southern Wales and the English West Midlands, proclaiming himself as the Earl of March in tandem to symbolise his preponderant position in the March or border region between England and Wales. All of this very quickly saw public sentiment towards Isabella and Mortimer shift. A regency council which included many of the leading nobles who had survived the purges of the Despenser period and the overthrow of Edward II had been established to govern the country until such time as Edward III was of an age to rule himself. It was revealed within months, however, that Isabella and Mortimer considered this to be merely a piece of window dressing to legitimize what was effectively rule by Isabella and her lover, who could not even marry each other after Edward II was killed, because Mortimer was still married to Joan de Joinville, with whom he had had a dozen children over the years. What created a scenario in which their regency became untenable were events in Scotland. In 1328, Isabella and Mortimer agreed to end the interminable war which had been underway between England and Scotland for decades by agreeing to recognise an independent Scotland with Robert Bruce as its king. To cement the alliance, Isabella offered for her youngest daughter, Joan of the Tower, to marry Bruce's son and heir, 4-year-old David, thus cementing a new rapprochement with the Scots. But while Isabella and Mortimer deemed this to be a good end to the conflict with the Scots, young King Edward III, who was now nearing his 16th birthday, considered it to be a humiliation and the abdication of much of his birthright. From this juncture, he was plotting to overthrow his mother and her lover and begin to rule in their place. The young king did not move immediately. His reticence was brought about by the failure of a rebellion in early 1329 by the 3rd Earl of Lancaster, a close cousin of the king's and the brother of the 2nd Earl of Lancaster, who was executed at the end of the Despencer War back in 1322. Lancaster had allied with several prominent nobles to overthrow Mortimer and Isabella, yet had been outflanked by their armies when he moved on London. He surrendered and was neutralized as a threat. The entire episode served as a warning to Edward III, and his household was filled with staff loyal to his mother and Mortimer. What finally brought matters to a head was the execution, in March 1330, of the Earl of Kent, a younger son of King Edward I and Edward III's half-uncle. The political realm was shocked by this transgression, and Lancaster now implored Edward to act, which he did. In mid-October 1330, he and his conspirators surrounded Isabella and Mortimer with their retinue at Nottingham Castle. Both were detained, and Edward finally affirmed his decision to begin ruling in his own stead on the cusp of his 18th birthday. 6 weeks later, Mortimer was executed at Tyburn in London. Isabella had pleaded for his life to be spared. Her son had refused to listen. Isabella was placed under house arrest following the fall of her and Mortimer from power and her lover's execution. Her detention was at Berkhamsted Castle in Hertfordshire to begin with for several weeks, before she was moved to Windsor Castle shortly before Christmas 1330 in what was evidently a relaxing of her conditions, as she was placed closer to where her son would have contact with her. During these months, there were clearly conversations had with her about how she could be reconciled to the new situation and rehabilitated. The story which would be presented going forward was that Isabella had been led astray by the malevolent Mortimer and as a result had temporarily failed to live in a manner which lived up to her responsibilities towards her son as King of England. As these negotiations were underway, she was also mourning Mortimer, and such was her emotional state that more than one historian has concluded that she suffered a nervous breakdown of some kind during these months. Eventually, she recovered, and ever a realist and pragmatist when it came to politics, she agreed to the new narrative which had been decided upon. Since she had arrived in England 22 years earlier as a child to marry Edward II, she had learned to survive on her wits. And the circumstances she found herself in now in the early 1330s, still some way shy of her 40th year, was no different. Satisfied that she posed no further threat to her son's reign, the decision was taken to set her free in 1332. While Isabella was free from 1332 onwards, there was no doubt at all that her political life was at a virtual end. The vast lands that she had accumulated from late 1326 onwards were surrendered to the Crown back at the end of 1330, but Edward now granted her Castle Rising in Norfolk and East Anglia, where she would live in her retirement. He was more than generous, allotting her a pension of £3,000 a year as well, a fortune in 14th century terms. despite a belief in the past that Isabella was in semi-exile here, this was certainly not the case. She was regularly visited over the years by leading nobles calling to see the Queen Dowager and the mother of the king, while Edward III called on occasion too, during which Castle Rising was transformed into the centre of the political world in England as the royal court relocated here. Over time, she became a doting grandmother, as the marriage between her son and Philippa of Hainaut, which she had negotiated back in 1326, resulted in a large brood of children from the birth of a new Edward, the Black Prince, in 1330, with many more following over the 1330s and into the 1340s. Over time, she was also welcomed back to the royal court at Windsor or in London on occasion. In many ways, it was the attainment of much of what she had always sought: comfort and stability, the very things which her husband's tumultuous reign had deprived her of from her teenage years onwards, and which she had begun her relationship with Mortimer in pursuit of. Isabella was able to play a slight role in political affairs in her long retirement, owing to events in France. Back in 1328, while she and Mortimer were effectively ruling England in the name of her son, Isabella's brother Charles died, the third and last of her brothers to die in quick succession after Louis in 1316, who seems to have succumbed to pleurisy, and Philippe in 1322. Although Louis had a son, he died in infancy after spending just 5 days on the throne himself in 1316, while both Philippe and Charles died without a male heir. Furthermore, the Salic law in France forbade a woman from becoming queen regnant, unlike in England. This opened up the possibility of Edward III having a legitimate claim to the French throne on account of his being the son of Isabella and the grandson of King Philippe the Fair. However, at a meeting of the French nobles shortly after Charles's death, it was determined that Philippe, Count of Valois, would succeed as King Philippe VI and start a new royal line. This dispensation held firm for nearly a decade. However, in 1337, England and France ended up at war after Philippe attempted to confiscate a chunk of England's remaining lands in western France around Gascony and the county of Ponthieu. With this, Edward went to war with the French. And not only that, but he decided to press his claim to the throne of France, which had been passed over in 1328. It was the beginning of what would be the 100 Years' War between England and France, as successive English monarchs tried to resurrect the Angevin Empire of the 12th century, when England had ruled much of France. As the woman through whom Edward based his claim to the French throne, and as one of the only senior surviving members of the royal house of Capet, Isabella suddenly had a new political significance from the late 1330s onwards. The 100 Years' War is generally divided into several distinct phases, in some of which England's fortunes were buoyant, while in others France gained the upper hand. The first phase lasted from the outbreak of the war in 1337 down to 1360, and was, generally, one in which England had the better of the fighting, particularly in the mid to late 1340s, when Edward led campaigns to France and won major strategic victories at the battles of Crécy in 1346 and the Battle of Calais the following year. With this, peace negotiations, in which it was assumed the French would make considerable concessions to Edward, were commenced. At this juncture, there was a proposal that Isabella, with her French heritage, would possibly be sent to France to negotiate on behalf of her son, whose claim to the French throne was based on Isabella being the last surviving child of King Philippe the Fair. Yet the outbreak of the Black Death, the worst first wave of the bubonic plague across Europe, scuppered the planned diplomatic mission and stalled affairs in the wider war thereafter for several years. It was not until 1356 that a major breakthrough was made again when Edward won another significant victory at the Battle of Poitiers, where King John II of France was captured. Following this, Isabella was involved in English negotiations with Charles II, King of Navarre, whose dominions lay to the south of the English possessions in Aquitaine in southwestern France, and who was a relative of Isabella's, his grandfather having been King Louis X of France, Isabella's brother. Charles was aiming to claim the French throne himself after King John was captured at Poitiers, though he failed in this, and whatever Isabella's intervention with him might have achieved, it could not stop Charles constantly switching sides in the wider conflict between France and England. The diplomatic mission to Charles of Navarre was one of the last actions of Isabella's life. She appeared at Windsor Castle, which her son had expanded dramatically to make the finest royal castle in England, for the St. George's Day celebrations there on the 23rd of April 1358, and was noted for the riches of her dress, which purportedly was inlaid with hundreds of precious gemstones, such as rubies, and upwards of 2,000 pearls. This ostentatious display of wealth was somewhat in contrast to her decision just a few weeks later to take the nun's habit of the Poor Clares, or Order of St. Clare, a monastic order founded centuries earlier by St. Clare of Assisi, one of St. Francis's first followers. She had been ill for several months, and must have been aware, when she made this decision, that her life was coming to an end. Isabella died on the 22nd of August 1358, most likely at 63 or so years of age. A longer than usual delay followed before her funeral was finally held on the 27th of November 1358. Although it had already become a tradition to bury the kings of England at Westminster Abbey by this time, this did not necessarily extend to queen consorts, and so Isabella was interred at the Greyfriars Church in London alongside her aunt, Queen Marguerite, Edward I's second wife, and the same king's mother, Eleanor of Provence, wife of King Henry III. There, she was laid to rest with the clothes she had worn as a child on the cusp of her teenager years the day she married Edward II, half a century earlier, draped over her. Her daughter, Joan of the Tower, was buried there as well 4 years later. Many of those who might have looked at Isabella as a malevolent figure who had extended the instability wrought by Edward II's reign beyond 1326 may have looked to the future as potentially being a more favourable time for England. And it must be said that for a time in the middle of the 14th century under her son, the kingdom's fortunes did markedly improve, as England had the better of the opening stages of the 100 Years' War. But they would soon have been disabused of this notion in the period following Isabella's death. England's problem, it transpired, did not lie with the former queen, but within the wider politics of the realm. Edward's grandson, King Richard II, presided over a period from his accession in the late 1370s, in which renewed unrest between England's nobles and the crown broke out. It ebbed and flowed until he was overthrown and killed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, Isabella's great-grandson, in 1399. And this only led to a period of vague stability until the middle of the 15th century, when a new civil war, the Wars of the Roses, erupted again. Isabella and Mortimer, it turned out, were symptoms of the political instability which constantly pitted the crown against the nobles in late medieval England, not the cause of it. Isabella of France has a reputation as one of the most formidable female figures of English history, being termed a she-wolf in two eminent early 21st century studies of her life. But if she became a she-wolf over time, she certainly did not arrive in England as one. Instead, she was a child being married off to an adult male in a foreign land for the sake of political expediency. Then, as she grew up, she learned that her husband was a ruler who was seemingly intent on choosing favourites at his court in ways which antagonized the majority of the political community. There was constant instability around her and war with foreign enemies. In this environment, she had to adapt and became ruthless herself in trying to promote her own interests in a situation where she knew her husband would not. It was this situation which led to her eventually beginning her relationship with Mortimer and overthrowing her own husband. She was badly regarded for centuries as a result, a development which simply points towards a latent misogyny in assessing the actions of a woman who was deemed to have broken the natural laws of matrimony. Many historians in the 19th and early 20th centuries suggested that she destabilized England as a result. But in reality, the conflicts of the 1320s were merely few amongst many which characterized the English crown's relationship with the wider political community between the 12th and 17th centuries. Ultimately, if Isabella was ruthless, it was in response to finding herself in this politically volatile environment at such a young and vulnerable age. What do you think of Isabella of France? Was she a malevolent schemer who destabilized England, or was she simply a woman who, having been cast into the maelstrom of English politics as a child, learned to survive as best she could? Please, let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.